As both of you were going out into this brave new world of disrupting industries, what were your chief concerns? And did APIs relate to that in any way, or did that come later?
For us, we looked at, if you don't mind, Dale. No. Half of our user base is mobile. So at some point, we knew we were going to have truckers driving around. We needed to digitize and have access to them and know where they were. So, we've all watched the growth of mobile devices and watched our web traffic, quickly shift over to a mobile device. So we've known it's happening. But from day one, we said, let's invest, and we have to do this because every one of, our users is going to be driving around wanting to look at loads and get capacity. So if and when, and then at some point we said, well, let's write it once and consume it ourselves, dog food it, as Sean said, and be able to, then have the auxiliary benefits of, we took on localization and versioning and everything with our APIs from day one, so that we knew we could use it internally to drive our website as well as our mobile apps and as well as our partners all at once.
Now, you started out with the concept of actually trying to disrupt something that was already broken. Now, you actually, Gordon, started in a very different place, right? You started more sort of in the traditional framework and then decided to morph into being disruptive within that confine of being a bank. So what were your chief concerns as you made that transition?
I mean, I think it was really opportunistic, obviously, when we looked at the opportunity of kind of the legacy systems around payments and credit cards and the amount of money, kind of obviously that was there to be made, was very fragmented. There's 5 companies that touch a payment when you buy something in a store. Which
a lot of companies that all have their hand in the pot, right?
And there's over $50 billion in the U.S. alone that's made, that's intermediating that transaction from party A to party B. And so I think the original question was how important was APIs, how important was connectivity? I think from us, our ability, our kind of whole strategy is doing this on kind of a white label kind of basis, or operating behind the scenes, kind of being the plumbing to all of this. It was really it was integral to kind of our ability to work with other non-banks, those other institutions that own the consumer. So having ways to kind of communicate those back ends was critical to what we're doing and remains critical.
From the perspective of where you are, has it changed over time? I assume it's changed in scale, but any other ways that you could see that the model has changed as a result of being able to have connectivity? Not necessarily the connectivity paradigm itself.
I think banking and financial, I think we're in the very early innings. I think this is wildly disruptive for the entire banking industry. It will take years and decades for it to play out, because I think most of the financial institutions there's over trillions of dollars of deposits that are sitting in institutions today. But it is fundamentally that the system of how we move money is 40 years old. So I think we're in the early innings of kind of how it's going to. It's a little bit of a fun part to be kind of on the front edge of that.
Well, we certainly could use something changed that's been in existence for the same way for 40 years. So I think that's probably pretty good. And that probably leads me to a question around shipping, because we've just talked a little bit about this slightly. But there's potentially quite a bit of conflict in the business model that you were trying to create when you look at trying to disrupt some of what shippers did, right? As you look at that concept of conflict, how did you convert that from conflict into opportunity? And then I'd like to get into talking a little bit about this notion of real time and how that might have changed.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, it was kind of the shared economy before the Uber and all these companies showed up. 12 years ago, I don't think we fully realized kind of where it was going to morph and how it was going to go. But there's a lot of government regulation around brokers and who can take part in the transportation, and legalized in the Department of Transportation, and who they own and everything. And we kind of look at it as the pros versus Joe's approach, and do we support both? And what is our legal obligation to show feedback and tell people that if you want to save exponentially more, you can not use a professional versus someone who's certified. We kind of said, we're going to show you all the information and publicize and be completely transparent and allow you to make an informed decision and try to offload that legal battle that we didn't want to potentially. That's probably all I should say about that.
I want to pick up on something that you said earlier, and this was the concept: if it was painful, you automate it, right? How long did it take you to get to that point where you decided you needed automation?
Yeah, and someone else, I was talking to someone last night, he said, if you do it more than once, automate it. So our continuous deployment process was not an overnight thing. It definitely, every single day we would, or we did deploys twice a week or once a week, and we tried, we completely say, okay, what does it take? And like, we didn't have, an IT department that we had to go question and say, hey, we're going to do this, and we're going to take over all this responsibility. I mean, we were small, so we got to take complete ownership from the beginning, and we hired a dedicated person just to automate the process at some point, because it became such an important thing for us to maintain and go forward, and make sure that we didn't affect our end users when we deployed. But to answer your question, it was probably a good 6 months of, making the system as robust as possible to get to the point where, the click of a button, it's live 20 minutes later.
Gordon, is your organization at the point where they're thinking a lot about automation, or is it still pretty new in terms of how you're looking at APIs?
I think we look at it, at automation as kind of integral to kind of what we're doing, right? I mean, I think it's again, the banking side, the payment side, what's so nice about it is like it's digital money. It's in a way of moving money from party A to party B. It's already in the format of being automated, and I think it's just the automation that is predominantly used today is this 30 to 40-year-old kind of old technology systems of how the systems talk. I think what's doing it for us is that automation is going from, let's say, a day process or a 2-day process to move money to instantaneous. And that's what's kind of revolutionary to kind of the whole ability of kind of the U.S. payment system.
Well, and I imagine that's where the opportunity is for you in terms of making money, right?
It's making money, it's reducing risk, and I think obviously when you have lots of money floating around the system where it takes a day to move from party A to party B and the system breaks, you have a lot of money in flux. So I think there's from a regulatory perspective and public policy perspective, there's lots of pushes towards getting to more real-time payments to reduce kind of systemic risk in the system.
Makes perfect sense. Now, both of you actually have businesses that I think are highly API driven, right? You want to connect to other partners, and that's a critical part of your business. So I imagine that concept of having an API platform started pretty early on in your organizations. But did you put metrics around it at that point in time? Do you have metrics around it now?
Hire someone who knows APIs. Like, it's easy to kind of learn and do all this stuff, and you can stumble through it for 6 months or a year or whatever it takes. But we kind of were like, we need to get there fast. We need to get our mobile apps up fast. So we kind of went out and said, let's get someone who knows the rest and knows what it's going to take and knows that we're not going to stumble across and have 7 different versions by the time we finally get there. So I forgot the question.
The question was basically, did you start with the notion of having metrics around APIs, or did that come
so,
later?
So very quickly, we knew what success was, but as Sean says, it doesn't happen. You don't get your developers and you don't realize exactly what that onboarding and how it's going to work. You have a business need and you at some point say, okay, we'll build the API to solve that business need. And then very quickly you start to have conversations when people come and say, hey, I'd like to do this. And you go, oh, great, it's already written. There's developer.uship.com. Go ahead and hit it. And you very quickly catch up an hour ahead of the requests that are happening in your industry.
Is this something that when you were looking at the ND Bank Group that you actually said, okay, we're going to dedicate resources out of the gate, or did this come to you later?
I think it was kind of embedded in kind of the whole strategy of what we were doing, of kind of integration of data. But I think we were doing it in kind of a tiered fashion. I mean, I think the first part was kind of putting the infrastructure in place so that behind the APIs, kind of the infrastructure that can support type of integration. And then how we thought about metrics and policies, I think we thought about it in 2 broad ways. And one is the types of data. Obviously, there's data that is very safe and secure and may not be touched from a banking perspective. And I think we kind of carved that out, and kind of protected information. And then it's the other data. It's the additional stuff. It's the additional services that is not what we call mission critical, to the banking industry. That is the stuff we've really started with. And I think over time, as we solve and we get more kind of confident with our ability to secure various platforms and channels, we'll dabble into some more integrated solutions. But we're really we are at the early stages of all this.
Yeah, I think the concept of the types of regulation that you have right now that you have to deal with make that very interesting. But I like this notion of being able to carve out what you can do today and what you can do moving forward, because I think that's critical in a strategy. And it kind of tees off on some of the things that Lee was saying about this notion of contextual security, and I think that's your version of contextual security. I have a question for you, Andy, that came in from the audience, and it's basically, how do you version APIs?
Yeah, so we, maybe I'm prompt for this question. So we actually started in the header and very quickly decided to move to the URL. The goal here just being that it's just easy to use. Like, it's much more friendly, like, and in a continuous deployment world, like, we need to make sure that we can push up changes and we can version as quickly as possible and do stuff. But at some point, knowing with regression tests, 1,500 regression tests running in less than 5 minutes, we need to know and that every version, and we can run against different versions and stuff. And we just decided that through the header, it's easy to increment, and we could go very micro versions and go through that whole stuff. But through a lot of debate and a lot of fumbling, we really decided that a URL, in the long run, for how readable it is and everything, made more sense. So,
can either of you cite some examples of how having an API program has been successful for you?
you can't do mobile without it. I mean,
Flat out, full stop.
Yeah, for us, knowing we wanted to have the best mobile experience possible, it was a no-brainer. And then we actually carve out and have a separate API team that their sole goal is to stay ahead of our mobile needs. And so 4-6 of them, that's all they do is write APIs all day. They have a tech writer, they have a QA automation engineer that automates the entire process through it, and an API architect that decides what the API is going to look like, so it's consistent and readable and friendly. So.
I think for us, again, it would be, we're looking to kind of operate behind the scenes as kind of this payment engine. And I think, use an example of social media, certain types of chat services where it's been communications, instant communications, and I think there's a trend now, or movement out of adding not only just texting but also money movement in a social media. So I think that involves this kind of integration of payments and the like in a very kind of secure but real-time manner of those kind of connectivities for kind of payments inside social media chats.
Right, so that's getting yourself embedded into other people's processes and services, right, which is really critical, and that makes sense. And that's a great example, because person-to-person payment is primed to explode from all the research that we've done. So once you open up a API infrastructure to people create new and interesting things that you didn't think of, right? Any surprises or examples of interesting, cool things that have happened as a result of that?
There were areas of the products that we knew we wanted to build out. For example, a search, tied into all the search data, some search tools to automatically build a trip builder if I want to go from here to here, and show me the most profitable route. It was on our product roadmap. We just never ever got to it. And a company called us a couple of weeks ago and said, "Hey, I've got this, and I want this. Do you have an API to do it?" And I said, "Here are the APIs." And it's as an example of, and at this point we're like, "Wow, this is great." And it was a classic example of where if you build it, they will come.
That makes sense. So Sean was actually talking about this concept of an executive, not sponsor, but beyond sponsor kind of evangelist. Do you find that in your organization is you? Do you have specific people?
It's probably me.
It's probably you.
Well, I think
you're the CEO. You be the ultimate executive.
Right. Everybody has a boss. I got bosses too. But I think it's interesting for financial services. Let's just talk broadly about banking financial services. I think it's very, very much of a challenge because of this. I think we're a different breed. I think we're very unique because I think it comes from the top down with regard to wanting to embrace kind of this movement. But I think financial services in general is more backward looking, more safety and security, and not wanting to change. And I think it's been a very, very big challenge for banks to make this evolution. And I think those that have almost every medium to large institution has started an innovative section inside their organization. 9 times out of 10, they get killed over time because of this issue around there's always somebody that's going to be a naysayer. And when it comes to banks and money, it's easy to say no.
Thank you, Tony.
Our API team has 3 needs, right? Solve our mobile needs. Our business development team comes to them every single day and says, "Hey, I've got a client who wants to do this," or "How can we do this?" And so that evangelist kind of changes depending on who's asking and who's coming calling. So I would argue it's our API architect at some point on that team and deciding and kind of getting all the feedback about who's asking for what and what the needs are and how our API is going to be organized. It's a unicorn role. Like it's like how technical are they and can they get on a stage and have a conversation? It's hard. Yeah.
When you look out at the next year or two, what do you think are the things that will help you drive success? Are they technology-oriented? Are they people-oriented? Are they process-oriented?
I think it's all the above, for us, because it's such greenfield for us. It's just all new for banking, right? I think one of the biggest top of the list is security and safety, and is security of the data, and with all these breaches that are taking place, and how do we become more open, okay, as an industry? The concept of APIs and connecting, all that's great. It sounds awesome. Yes. But I think it completely opens up this issue around how do you protect the data. Now, the good news, that's the bad news. The good news is there's all kinds of kind of modern of innovation that's taking place in protecting security and data. And the baseline is pretty easy to get over, because if you think about a piece of plastic and a mag stripe, again, that's 30, 40-year-old technology. So I think it's scary to open up what we do, because I think most banks are fortresses and after layers and layers and layers, and that's why they're so generally not innovative. So we're kind of breaking new ground. We're trying to making it more open, which is scary, but I think hopefully by marrying some of the new stuff that's going on in encryption and data security and all this stuff's around identity protection, all this, some of the speakers talked about, I think is the exciting part of it.
All of the above?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Okay, that's all right, because somebody asked you a question. What stack does uShip use in their API program? So you guys build tools versus buy?
So technology stack. So I'm probably embarrassed to admit this, but we're on a mostly Microsoft stack, but we pull in an enormous amount of open source technologies, whether it be MongoDB or, whatever it is when it makes sense. But for the most part, it's C# and a web API, which is unbelievably fast for writing REST APIs. So we've had no limitations there, and then a lot of open source stuff around the REST test infrastructure around Cucumber and Gherkin, and there's actually even Concord. We've open sourced how we have parallelized the 1,500 tests to run in less than 5 minutes. All that stuff is open sourced on our GitHub account.
Okay.
So.
I have one question for Gordon and then one question for both of you, and we'll call it a wrap. So Gordon, someone in the audience asked, what role do you see government playing in the new API economy?
Oh, it's a good question. I think they're way back to the start. They're in the first inning, and APIs to them, I don't even think it's even in their vernacular. I think that stuff plays out 7 or 8, it's inning 7 or 8. Having said that, okay, even though I think the government in general, any one of the regulatory agencies, are really pushing for the advantages of a digital economy. And what that means is for the consumers, more services to more people at lower costs. So I think they're very open to it. And I think they're in a challenged role of making sure that they keep regulation and safety and soundness of the system in place first and foremost. But then I think almost every one of the agencies, ironically, there's a lot of negative press about regulators and crushing innovation. And the irony is actually, I think, from a public policy perspective, many of them are actually very proactive in their thinking. And that is because the private sector has been not as innovative as they really should have been. So I think from a government perspective, I think they're very open and nurturing. And even I've heard it for the first time the other day of one of the regulatory agencies creating a regulatory sandbox to consider kind of some new products that get better services to more people at lower costs. So I think they're really pushing it.
Excellent. So my last question is, and I know that each of you addressed a bit of this as you went through your presentations, but what one piece of advice would you give people that are out in the audience about advancing with APIs?
For me, it's automation. Have 100% confidence that what you've written and what you've built will not break, because you cannot get people off your API once they're on it. That is a good thing, but you have to change, and you have to innovate as a company, and you have to move on to the next version and the next version. And it works, and people don't want to have no motivation, can't queue up a dev team to go back and fix it. I've gotten requests to say, hey, stop using this API, and I'm like, why? Like, it does everything I need. So, figure out a way in your strategy that and you can put together a deprecation plan, but ultimately, if you're making money off a client, you're not at some point going to turn them off and say sorry. So support and know what that future plan is and that migration plan is, and just assume that it's not going to happen nearly as fast as you want it to.
Any concepts on partnering or other things?
Yeah, I mean, I think our perspective, again, I'm biased, so coming at it from the banking perspective. I think a lot of non-banks, not a lot of financial people come at banking to be the equivalent to data, traditional data APIs. And I think there's been this frustration between, and two different, of like banks are so hard to deal with, and banks say, well, technology companies are too, they're flying off the seat of the pants, and so I think there's two schools that kind of, and there's tension there. So I think from a non-bank perspective, coming into a financial institution, whether it's banking or commerce or anything, there is a level of kind of integrity standards that is different, and I'll say higher, because of the safety issue. That a lot of non-banks don't appreciate. So I think it's just a different animal when you're dealing with a commerce in a commerce enterprise, around that. So I think that's just something to be a little bit wary of. And banks generally aren't doing it because they're being difficult. They're just trying to maintain a standard of kind of, and we don't have as much flexibility to try things. And if they don't work, it's a problem.
Yeah. I think this concept of standards, though, even if you're not in banking, will still be important as we think of security and IoT and wearables and a whole bunch of things coming down the pipe. So well placed. Thank you so much for your time.